All right, welcome back to the show, Met Flex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and today I have another solo episode for you. So today's episode is all about carb-ups and carb cycling. So this is another Q&A. I got a few questions related to this subject, so I figured I'd just dive into everything carb-ups and carb cycling to answer these questions, which I'll mention in a second. But before we dive in, I just want to let you know that I'm actually starting a weekly newsletter. It's like, I've done this in the past, but this one is going to be a little bit different. So every Friday, I'm going to release a weekly newsletter or kind of like a content roundup for the week. So it's going to include, a snapshot of the week. So it'll include things that I've personally learned throughout the week. It'll include what I'm reading, what I'm currently reading in terms of, nutrition books or business books or self-development books or whatever it may be. I'll have a podcast episode roundup. So the 2 podcasts for the week, I'll shoot those to you via email, or it'll be in this newsletter. And then also, recipes of the week or a food that I'm enjoying that week, or maybe like a new product. And then I'll also probably be doing some client shout outs and spotlights, and then some other things, recent blog posts that I've written, or maybe blog posts that I want to highlight from the past. So this weekly newsletter it's for you. It's for all of my listeners and followers and everybody. And really the goal is to just give you kind of a snapshot of my week and a snapshot of the content that I put out throughout the week, and then also just provide you with some tidbits to hopefully get excited about, looking forward to towards the end of the week. So if you want to join my newsletter, I'll add a link in the show notes. You can subscribe to it, and the first newsletter will be out this week. Swipe up if you're listening to this on iTunes, and you should see a link that says subscribe to my newsletter, and you just put your name and your email, and you'll be on the list. All right, so let's get into the first question related to carb cycling. So the question I got was, is carb cycling a way to get metabolically flexible? If so, how many carbs and how often? So the reason why I decided to kind of dive into this question a little bit deeper is because there's so many different kind of aspects to it, and it's hard to answer this question in just one answer. The main reason being because everybody's so different, so it is different for everyone. But there are some things behind carb-ups and some misinformation and some other things that I just wanted to dive in to give you a little bit of a background on this. So the answer to the first part of the question, is carb cycling a way to get metabolically flexible? The short answer is yes, absolutely. And we need to think about what metabolic flexibility is. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, hopefully you're familiar with that. But it's basically just teaching your body to be able to use both fuel sources. So to be able to use carbs and sugar when it's warranted, and then also to be able to tap into your fat stores and ketone stores and use those for energy when it's warranted. So in my opinion, as you probably know, metabolic flexibility should be the ultimate end goal for everyone. That's what I feel. It allows us, if we are metabolically flexible, it allows us to, really benefit from being a long-term fat burner, thriving in our modern world, optimizing all aspects of performance. So both, mental and physical. It allows us to access ketones and fat for fuel, which if you're following a higher carb standard American diet, you've probably never been able to do that. And also just become more in tune with our bodies and what foods and nutrients serve us at specific times, in our lives, and then also with the specific activities that we're doing. So that's kind of the ultimate end goal. Metabolic flexibility, in my opinion, is ultimate end goal. So I believe that low carb and ketogenic diets are amazing for so many reasons, including, reducing inflammation and reversing and preventing insulin resistance, which we know leads to a lot of other issues and some other diseases that we are currently facing in our modern world. But there are, in my opinion, 3 main drawbacks that I see and have seen both with myself and my clients over the years when following a chronic long-term, very low carb keto diet, like forever, like very low carb for, years on end. So the first two reasons, and this is just my opinion and kind of what I've seen, again, what I've seen with myself and my clients through my research as well and all of that. So the first two reasons are more physiological and the last reason is more psychological. So I'll kind of just go through these three reasons just so you can kind of get a background and an idea of this. So the first one is when you don't eat carbs for an extended period of time, your body can actually lose the enzymes and gut bacteria it needs to properly process those carbs. So this in itself can actually cause metabolic inflexibility. So when you do eat carbs, your body may not be able to process them just because you haven't eaten them in a while, right? You lose those enzymes, you lose that gut bacteria to process those particular nutrients. And so you might get, crazy blood sugar spikes and dips, maybe some bloating issues, digestion issues, things like that. So that's the first reason, that I've seen personally and with my clients following a lower carb diet, that for very, not low carb, but keto, very, very low carb, like under 20, 30 grams total for an extended period of time. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So the second reason is another potential drawback of a long-term, very low carb keto diet is that insulin levels can become chronically low. So in the complete absence of carbs, little to no insulin is secreted, which can actually cause cells to become resistant to insulin signaling in the same way that too many carbs can. So this sounds crazy, especially if you've, done your research on keto and low carb and all of that, but it's potentially true. It's not something that is talked about a lot, but it is something that makes sense if you think about it. So basically, in other words, chronically high and chronically low insulin levels is probably not optimal. We know chronically high levels is probably definitely worse, but chronically low can have its side effects as well. So we do know that any food has some effect on insulin, but so for example, protein and even fat has an effect on insulin levels. When you consume any type of calories, you will have some type of insulin response, but we know that when you consume carbs or sugar, that's when you get the biggest insulin response. Protein would be second, and then fat would be the lowest insulin response, but you still do get some. So that's something you have to understand as well. And again, I talked about this before, but insulin isn't the devil. Like, we need insulin to live. The issue is that the standard American diet is pretty high carb and it's causing chronically elevated insulin levels in many people. And this is causing increased chronic inflammation, which then leads to tons of problems and issues and things that we talk about with diabetes, even Alzheimer's, all of those things. That is due to chronic inflammation, which can be a result of developing insulin resistance. But insulin, again, it's not the devil. Insulin is a signaling hormone for many different processes and things throughout our body. For example, just a few examples, in terms of thyroid, it helps upregulate enzymes that stimulate beneficial thyroid hormone conversions. For our brain, it binds to different brain cell receptors to help regulate hunger and satiety, inflammation within our brain, and some other cognitive functions. It's also involved with other hormones. So insulin balances estrogen and testosterone levels, interacts with cortisol, growth hormone, dopamine, serotonin, all of these other hormones, they all interact. And these are just a few of the jobs of insulin. So again, it's not the devil, but there is a rise, especially nowadays, of insulin resistance. But on the other side of things, we have to realize too that when we're striving for metabolic flexibility, sometimes having chronically low levels of insulin can be an issue as well. So those are the two kind of main physiological aspects of this. And then the third one is just it's a psychological aspect of it. And this is what I call carb phobia. So this is like the mental side of things. And one of the reasons why maybe following a very low carb keto diet for a very extended period of time might not be advantageous. And so this is something that I went through myself. It's what a lot of my clients that I work with go through. It's just this idea that you're just scared to eat carbs, even like whole food carbs that come from the earth and are whole and not processed. So fruits, sweet potatoes, squash, things like that. You develop this carb phobia, just like we talk about all the time, like we developed that fat phobia over the years. And so some people are now developing this carb phobia. And so that's kind of the third reason that I've seen for this to be an issue long term. So what now? Like, what do we do now? So really the goal is to strike a balance of metabolic flexibility and optimal insulin sensitivity, right? So that's probably what the end goal is. And potentially implementing carb-ups and carb cycling can help to do this, can help you become more metabolically flexible, and can also help with that insulin sensitivity factor as well, because if you are, chronically high carb, then you might develop more insulin resistance versus if you were maybe home base was low carb and you implemented carb cycling or carb ups throughout a period of time, depending on your specific goals and what works for you, which I'm going to get into in a second. So there are a few signs and symptoms that could tell you if you may need or potentially want to try a carb up if you've been low carb keto for a long period of time or an extended period of time. The first one is if you're at a low or healthy body fat percentage. So this is the first one that I would think about, especially if you've been low carb keto for a long period of time and you're already at like a very low body fat percentage, or you're having issues related to that. So this could have something to do with chronically low leptin levels and some other issues related to that, which I'm not going to dive too deep into today, but I did talk about this with Allie Miller. I will link it in the comments, and we talk all about leptin levels, leptin resistance. We talk about carb cycling as well. So definitely check that episode out if you haven't already. Another sign and symptom is and this is one of the most common, your menstrual cycle is quote unquote off. So maybe it's absent, it's short, it's long, you're having issues with it on a, extended period of time, not just maybe 1 month, but maybe like 2 or 3 months it's been off. That could be a potential sign to implement a carb up, which I'm going to talk about in a second of how to do that. Maybe you have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep at night. You don't get satisfied by the foods that you're eating. You feel anxious. Maybe you feel constant hunger, having hormonal issues that are related to maybe your thyroid or other sex hormones. Another sign symptom, you've plateaued in your fat loss efforts. So if you're trying to lose weight or trying to lose fat, and you haven't been seeing the results that you were hoping for, and you've been, quote unquote, doing everything that you can, and you just can't get past that plateau. Your exercise performance is not improving, or it's declined. And ultimately, if you want to strive for ultimate metabolic flexibility, implementing carb cycling, carb ups can be beneficial. I do talk more about metabolic flexibility in the MetFlex Life course, which is the free course that you can access in the show notes. If you haven't checked that out yet, I will link that below. And I also go into a lot more detail and teach you all about implementing carb cycling specific for your goals in my 3-month Keto for Women program. So I will also link that in the show notes. If you want to check it out, you can click on it and kind of see what that program includes, see some of the testimonials from previous women who have gone through the program, and just get a better idea of that. If you're interested, again, we dive into all things carb cycling. I teach you all about it and show you how to implement it for your specific goals. So the second part of this question was how many carbs and how often? So again, this is kind of a loaded question, and I have to dive into a few different areas here, but I like to think of carb cycling in different categories based on the goal or what you're trying to achieve, and also the length or frequency of what you're implementing, right? So I like to look at carb ups on kind of different timelines. So the first one is monthly carb ups, and these are specific to regulating your cycle. So for all my women out there, and if you're interested in implementing carb ups to help with regulating your cycle, if you've been having irregular cycles or issues with that, this looks like intentionally increasing carb intake during specific times of the month to ensure that your leptin levels don't get depleted and that your body maintains kind of an active metabolic balance. So that's kind of the premise of implementing monthly carb ups around your cycle. Specifically, the first way would be carbing up on days 19 and 20 of your cycle, which is 5 days post-ovulation. This is actually when the leptin levels are naturally their lowest. So leptin is the very important hormone that kind of controls our hunger and satiety and some other things within our body. So it's very, very important. And if you have chronically low leptin levels or declining leptin levels, that can be an issue. And so carbing up on days 19 and 20 of your cycle can actually help boost this leptin level, especially because it is naturally at its lowest during that time. And then also you can try that. And if you're not finding success with that, you can try implementing carb-ups on days 1 and 2 of your menstrual cycle. So this is the very start of your period, and this is the other point in your cycle when leptin levels are at its lowest. If you don't get a period or you have irregular periods, you can actually try to follow the moon cycle, and you use the full moon to signify ovulation. If you have no idea what I'm talking about with moon cycling, the moon cycles, sorry. I chat all about this on my YouTube channel under the hormone playlist when I talk about seed cycling, so I will link that in the show notes as well. And then if you are a postmenopausal woman, and obviously you don't get your cycle, you can carb up or carb cycle on the first 2 days of the month or any other consecutive 2-day period and try to just stay consistent with that. I'm going to get into kind of the the weekly carb ups next, but in terms of how many carbs that you would implement, it really depends on the person. It really depends on where you're coming from. So I can't give you like an exact number, but I like to start with at least going above 100 total carbs, playing around with it from there. So that's what I've found to work with myself and my clients in terms of boosting those carbs. Because if we think about it, 100 total carbs is still considered a low carb diet. So I would say if you're going to do a carb up, getting above that number, I found to be a good place to start. And then you could titrate up depending on your specific goals, where you're coming from, all of that. And that's, again, something that I dive into in the Keto Forum program more specifically, but that might just give you somewhere to start. So the next kind of category are the weekly carb ups. So I would say this is best for maybe people who engage in lower amounts of physical activity and are more seeking the health benefits of a low carb diet, but want to avoid some of the long-term effects. So this would look like picking, 1 or 2 days per week to eat a larger amount of carbohydrates. So above that 100 grams. For example, your carb up could be on a weekend or on your most physically active day. And again, the amount differs. It could be anywhere between 100 to even 300 grams of carbs, depending on the person, right? 300 is probably a very high amount, and that would be more, recommended probably for a man. But it depends. It depends where you're coming from, depends what your activity level is. I personally like doing a hybrid between the weekly carb ups, which I usually do on the weekends, and then daily pre and post workout carb cycling, which I'm going to talk about in a second, which you've probably heard of also is a kind of a targeted ketogenic approach. There's different labels for these different things, but it all depends on, you can label anything however you want. And this is kind of how I categorize them. So you can call it whatever you want, but the next category would be, daily pre or post workout carb ups. So this comes back to mostly performance based. So the question a lot of people tend to ask is, can you build muscle on a strict keto diet? I would say yes. The answer is yes, you can. Is a strict keto diet optimal for building muscle and increasing performance? Probably not. This is just from my experience. Again, from the research I've done, I think you can definitely build muscle on a ketogenic diet, a strict one, but most people do better. If the goal is building muscle and is increasing performance, most people do better incorporating some type of carbs for performance. Properly timed carb ups or refeeds can be an effective strategy for optimizing athletic performance and maintaining metabolic flexibility when you are following a low-carb keto diet. So again, that's kind of the end goal, in my opinion. And the reason being why most people can benefit from incorporating carbs, around their workouts is, especially if the goal is performance and building muscle, is because we know exercise is a stressor, right? We know when we exercise, it's a stress. And when stress is high and cortisol is elevated, we're in this sympathetic nervous system mode or state. So our nervous system has two different kind of modes, I guess you'd call them. So we have the sympathetic, which is the flight or fight mode. And then we have the parasympathetic, which is known as the rest and digest mode. So if we don't know how to properly shift out of that sympathetic state or mode and into the parasympathetic state, we end up in kind of this vicious cycle of stress overload. So again, we know exercise is a good stressor, but it is a stressor, right? And our body can begin to break down in multiple areas because it just can't recover. And it needs the ability to shift into that parasympathetic nervous system mode in order to fully recover. So our nervous system, as I talked about, it basically controls the ability to facilitate all of our recovery. And carbs can play a role in shifting us into that recovery mode, back into that parasympathetic state, mainly because of this factor. So the main reason is because insulin and cortisol actually have an inverse relationship. We know that cortisol is known as our stress hormone, and chronically elevated cortisol is not a good thing. We need cortisol. Cortisol, acutely elevated is fine, that's natural, but chronically elevated cortisol is not a good thing. The reason being for this is carbs can actually spike insulin, which we know, which can help to blunt the cortisol levels or, that stress response, which can aid in getting back into that parasympathetic state. So the fact that insulin and cortisol are opposing hormones, they have an inverse relationship. If you consume carbs, they spike insulin, which tends to plummet cortisol. And that can be a good thing if you are suffering from chronically high cortisol levels and you're trying to get into that parasympathetic state or that recovery mode post-exercise, right? So there's a few different ways you can time carbs for recovery. The first way would be including post-workout carbs. So this can help blunt that cortisol response to training, allowing our bodies to tap into that parasympathetic mode. You can, include evening carbs. So this can help our body to unwind and get a restful sleep. So get out of that stressful sympathetic state. If you are someone who tends to be wound up at night, including a carb-up at night may help you to kind of blunt that cortisol response as well. And then also raise some other hormones as well. We know sometimes carbs can bring up that serotonin level. So that's another potential benefit of that. Also, pre-workout carbs can be useful for those who are already cortisol dominant who live in a higher state of stress, because it can actually help balance the cortisol level prior to training. So that's another potential benefit of including carbs pre-workout, not just for that kind of energy standpoint, but because of this cortisol dominant standpoint, right? And then intra-workout carbs can play a role in controlling cortisol, allowing better muscle repair and growth, and also leading to better stress levels post-training, so after training. So those are just a few different reasons and ways that you can time carbs for specifically thinking about recovery, right? Recovery is super important. Whenever we're talking about building muscle and increasing performance, we have to think about recovery. And so I would say that pre and post-workout carbs, including those, are best for individuals that perform, multiple training sessions each week and they want to optimize their performance and recovery. So probably not super beneficial if you're just someone who maybe works out once a week or something like that. But if you are consistently training and you're looking to increase and optimize your performance and recovery, then you could potentially benefit from incorporating pre and post-workout carbs. So again, there's different ways to incorporate carbs pre and post-workout. I would say post-workout is probably most beneficial for recovery. You can increase your normal amount of carbohydrates in your first meal post-workout. That would be the easiest way to do it. Again, the amount differs, right? I would say an additional, depending on the person, additional 50 to even 150 grams of carbs, again, depending on the individual and your, status, your body weight, your muscle mass, your type of workout you're doing, how long you're working out. It all depends on the person. So I can't give you an exact number, but it really comes back to just trying it out for yourself and starting with maybe an additional 50, grams of carbs total to your, regular day. So maybe that looks like including like 25 grams of carbs extra in your post-workout meal or maybe before. Again, it all depends. So try it out for yourself if you're, struggling with any of these things that I chatted about, and see what works for you. And again, I always recommend getting your carbs from whole food, natural sources. So potatoes, fruits. You can even do white rice, things like that. So that would be my recommendation. And again, in the Keto for Women program, we implement carb-ups as refeed days. And so I won't dive too much into this, but I did talk about refeed days and the benefits of those for recovery as well, and for fat loss in the episode that I recorded a few weeks ago that was all about refeeds and diet breaks. So again, I'll link that in the show notes as well, so you can check that out if you haven't checked it out yet. And I think that will be, I talk a lot about carbs in that episode too, especially as it pertains to refeeds and diet breaks. So the second question related to carb ups was, what are your thoughts on coming off keto and being on a moderate carb diet for 1 month and then going back to keto? So this isn't specifically with carb ups, but it's more like a carb cycling on a longer term basis. So I think that it all comes back to where you're at in your journey and what your goals are. So those are the main things. The main thing to realize is that once you've been in ketosis and you've become, quote unquote, keto adapted or fat adapted, it's easier to get back into ketosis if that's your goal, right? If that's your goal to get into ketosis, the longer you've been in it for the long period of time, and I would say the longer you've gone periods of time with going in and out of ketosis, the easier it is to actually get back into it. And this is all coming back to that metabolic flexibility piece of it, right? So your metabolism becomes familiar with what happens when your glucose or blood sugar supply drops. Your body knows it's not starving, so it doesn't resist the shift. And once you've achieved metabolic flexibility, you can pretty much slip in and out of ketosis with ease. That's what I found for myself and for a lot of the clients that I work with as well. And that's why I believe metabolic flexibility is the end goal. So being able to shift in and out of this state of ketosis, being able to use fat as fuel, use ketones as fuel, but also include healthy carbs. And when I say healthy, I mean, whole food carbs in your diet when you need to, or when it's warranted, or any of the things that I just talked about in the beginning of this episode with the signs and symptoms that you may want to implement a carb up. So again, I would focus on clean, healthy carbs for sure, but then also realize that, it's real life. And there's sometimes when we're going to want to have a cupcake or a cookie or something like that, and being able to have that and not feeling guilty about it, right? And just moving on and getting back into our normal diet or our normal, nutrition protocol. That is what is important for a lot of people as well, especially when we talk about carb phobia. So really my goal is to help people realize that you can include these things in your life. They are part of our modern life. You just have to know how to do it strategically and do it in a way that you can plan this out. And I'm not saying that I want you to go eat cookies and cupcakes. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you can include them, right? You just have to, get out of that mentality of it being something that you look at as super guilty, or, getting out of that mentality of consuming one cookie and then feeling like you've destroyed your diet and now you need to go eat the whole tray of cookies. That is the thing that we need to avoid. And so I think that becoming more metabolically flexible, not just with your body, but also with your mind, is super important. So I think that to answer this question, coming off keto and being on a moderate carb diet for a month, I think it's a great idea, but it depends where you're coming from, right? If you've been keto and low carb for a while, then why not try it? See how you feel. It's definitely a great way to become more metabolically flexible and build up that anti-fragile metabolism. So I would say anti-fragile metabolic flexibility, if you want to think about it this way, think like fragile things break when they're put under stress, right? Resilient things resist the stress, but stay the same. Anti-fragile things adapt and get better. So if you want to be healthy, right, and metabolically flexible, then you should aim for building an anti-fragile metabolism. And I would say that in itself is the end goal. So I hope that all made sense. Let me know if you have any questions about this. You can always, ask questions on social media. Check out my website. I have tons of blog posts where I talk about carb ups and carb cycling. Also, the Keto for Women program. I'll link that below. And yeah, I hope that information helped. And again, if you have questions that you want me to answer, I will always be posting question box on my Instagram story on Mondays, so you can ask questions there and I will answer them on the podcast. All right, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.